Hi, my name's Susie Kocher. I'm a Natural Resources Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra Nevada, and I cover El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties. I'm a registered professional forester, and I work with forest landowners to help them understand how to better manage their forests. I'm here to talk to you about wildfire and drought in Sierra Nevada forests. I'm going to cover fundamentals of fire in the Sierra Nevada, what the effects of drought are on wildfire, how to mitigate your fire risk in a Sierra forest, or how to mitigate your risk in a home anywhere in California or across the nation, because we all have to worry about how wildfire affects us. So I wanted to start first with a short fire history of Sierra forests. So we know from the scientific record that Sierra forests are adapted to frequent low-intensity fire. The picture on the right here is of a older tree, ponderosa pine, that has a fire scar. So the fire burned up to the side of this tree and went by, and this tree survived. You can see the black there, that's the fire scar. So we have a lot of evidence, including ethnographic interviews with Native American tribes. So pre-Euro-American settlement, Native tribes did a lot of burning in California. They did it to keep the forests open, promote acorns, which was their primary food source, and meadow foods, plants, tubers, that sort of thing. They did it to suppress insects in the forests and develop pliable shoots in shrubbery for basketry materials. Many of the tribes didn't have pottery, and so basketry was their #1 technology, and they needed young pliable shoots that grew post-fire. And so there's still plenty of Native Americans who can tell us about their fire and burning histories. So we know that was one of the sources, that the forests were actively managed for that. We also had plenty of lightning fires, so natural occurrences. The other big source of data that we have is the study of tree rings. The study of tree rings is called dendro for trees, chronology for sequencing or time. So this is a picture of a tree ring sequence. You can see growing from a center. There's a scar. These black lines are all individual fires that burned next to this tree while it was still alive. So you can see how in this particular tree, you could actually go through and measure one ring per year and figure out how often a fire came by this particular site. You can do it on a single tree or in several trees, and that is called a fire history, and you can understand what the natural plus Native American burning fire regime was in a particular area. So looking at that, we have a recent estimate that showed that California was burning all the time in the past. Between 4 and 12 million acres in California probably burned every year. So that's between 5 and 12% of the landscape annually through native and natural sources. So before fire suppression started, skies were probably smoky in the summer and fall all the time. C.H. Merriam was the chief of the U.S. Biological Survey, and in 1898 he commented that of the hundreds of people who visit the Pacific Slope in California every year to see the mountains, few see more than the immediate foreground and a haze of smoke which even the strongest glass is unable to penetrate. So the idea that fire is controlled and rare as an occurrence is really a very modern idea that we probably need to abandon, because we've gotten to the point where we can't really control all those wildfires anymore like we used to. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the different forest types so that we can understand in the past how often they used to burn. So the types of forests in California vary according to elevation and latitude. Our individual native trees are adapted to a wide range of moisture, elevation, snow loads, light, and they are found in natural groupings throughout the Sierra and the rest of the state. And each one of these groupings has its own characteristic fire return interval in the past that we can tell from tree ring records. So just highlight on this map a little bit, these light green areas, that's the mixed conifer forest. As you go up a little higher, dark green, that's true fir. Get over into the east side of the Sierra Nevada, there's some east side pine, some areas mostly that are lodgepole pine. We have clumps of different types of forests depending on the elevation and latitude. And so the time that each of these areas evolved to burn is called the fire return interval. So it's the time between two successive fire events at the given site. So in the ponderosa pine belt, our records show every 5 to 12 years a low intensity fire would come through in most acres. Mixed conifer going up, 8 to 20, red fir higher up, 15 to 50, subalpine between 25 and 60 years. So that's this information on a different scale mapped. This is a fire return interval map of the Sierra Nevada. So if you look at all these brown areas, what this is saying is that in the past, before fire suppression, these areas burn on average every 11 years. Obviously not like clockwork, it's an average number. As you go up the hill, it's less so. You get into those yellows, it's about 40. You get up into the greens, it's in the 60s. The darker greens, 150 years. And so the reason that these numbers go up is that the higher up you go, the moister it is, and the slower it is for the vegetation to grow back naturally after a fire. So in this brown area, there's enough productivity in the forest that the needles are dropping, the branches are dropping. It can carry a fire every 11 years. But when you get up higher in those snowy areas, it takes a lot longer for that area to build up the fuels necessary. And it's moist longer during the year, so it's a less frequent fire regime. I want to give you, on another scale of colors, a close-up. So this is where I live. I live on Lake Tahoe. There's my house. Right around the lake, you're in that 5 to 18-year time zone when you would expect fires to go through about every 5 years. Just a little bit far away, so see, this is 10 miles. Less than 10 miles away, you're up into this every 100 years because it's very high in elevation, you have mountains, very snowy, and it doesn't burn as often. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the variability in location, time frame for natural fire return. So the next thing to think about is how severe is the fire. So a fire that's very frequent doesn't allow a lot of fuels to build up. And so generally these are low severity surface fires. So you can see in this picture there's a little bit of fuel built up. The flame lengths are very low. Anything with less than about 4 feet is considered low severity. And at that level, it's not very likely to kill very many trees. And it can be suppressed directly by people just using hand tools. And so this kind of fire takes out some of these understory fuels and is considered to be what was the most common in the past before fire suppression. That these are what were coming through every 11 years. At the same time, there were probably pockets of higher severity. So this is a picture of something you might call moderate severity fire. There are individual trees torching out, especially in the understory. And these ladder fuels, which on their own could conduct fire up into the crowns of the trees and kill all the rest, are burning in small pockets. So you had flame lengths up to 10 feet tall, and some trees are killed. It's a little patchy. Then the highest severity of fire is the high severity or crown fire, and that's what this is a picture of. The fires are burning through the crowns of the trees. There's surface fuels which support it to continually stay up there. The behavior is unpredictable, and in these cases, most of the trees are killed outright or might die from the heat. And they're very hard to suppress. These are the ones that are out of control and that we worry about a lot more than the previous ones that I showed you. So now the fire return interval and the severity of wildfire are linked, and this is in a natural fire regime. So these are the ones I'm talking about here in the Sierra Nevada. They all had pretty quick fire return interval, less than 35 years, low and mixed severity, meaning often, frequent, most of the trees survive just fine. Down here you see Rocky Mountain lodgepole. So this is something that is similar to the large fires in Yellowstone in 1988. Those forests are evolved to burn at high severity. They all burn every 35 to 200 years, and they start over. It's a stand replacing fire, leading to new seedlings coming in afterwards. So it's really important to keep in mind where you are and which ecosystem you're in to understand how the systems there evolved and what kind of fire they evolved in. So for example, our ponderosa pine here that I showed you at the very first slide, it's got a nice thick bark and it can handle these fires coming through. Also, it naturally self-prunes like this, so there aren't a lot of branches at the base. And that way, a little fire can come by, it doesn't get up into the canopy, and it outcompetes others which are not so well adapted. So that's important to keep in mind because our forests evolved to a very frequent fire regime, which was then suppressed starting in about the late 1800s. And just a short history of that, there were some really big fires back in 1910, the big blow up, the big burn, burned 5 million acres, Montana and the West, and it killed over 79 people. There were firefighters who were killed, there were cities that burned down, and it was considered a huge problem. And so after that time, the Forest Service stressed fire prevention and the need to control fires as quickly as possible. There were some more burns in the 30s on the West Coast, and the management agencies just decided that there should be a no-burn policy. And the policy put into effect was that all fires had to be controlled as quickly as possible, preferably during the very first afternoon. And if you didn't get it by the first day, you were going to get it by the next day at 10 a.m. or the next day, and that was called the 10 a.m. policy. It wasn't until about the 1970s that managers, scientists really started to appreciate the role of fire in the natural ecosystem and the role that it played. And there are many proponents of more use of prescribed fire, although we have many institutional barriers to move that forward. So our understanding has evolved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our policies have evolved to where they need to be to improve the situation. So there are a lot of consequences to fire suppression. This is a picture series in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana after fire was excluded in 1909, starting here on the left. You can see 1895, by 1909 it's starting to grow in, and then here's the conditions today. Without a small, low severity fire to burn up the small understory, it's gotten crowded and overstocked, as we would say in forestry. Here's one that's closer. This is in Plumas County, the east branch of the North Fork of the Feather River under snow in 1890. There's been no logging there. It was naturally very widely spaced, and the white is the snow. Here it is in 93, about 100 years later. All those areas have filled in with a lot of living trees and fuel. And that's one reason that our fires are getting so much more severe over time. This is a graph from Carl Skinner, a fire ecologist at the Pacific Southwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, that can give you a little graphic of this effect. So they did a tree ring study. They could show when all the trees in this particular area established. And they could also see the fires. So here were the fires, the green bars right here. Here's how often they were happening at Black's Mountain Experimental Research Station, up until just before 1900. The yellow trees are new trees establishing. So some trees would establish, there'd be a fire, some trees would live, some would die, and over time you have kind of a fully stocked forest. Here is what happened after they stopped putting out the fires. So you can see this huge pulse of trees establishing in 1900, 1910, 1925. You get down in here in the 70s and pretty much all the growing space is occupied. And these stands are getting older and having some natural mortality that leads to the fuels on the ground. This is how we've gotten into a big problem in the Sierra Nevada. So there are a lot of ecological consequences to fire suppression and drought. Some of these are very similar, which is why I'm talking about them together. The ecological consequences of fire suppression are basically increased stress due to water competition between trees that now have so many more neighbors than they used to when they used to be burned through low severity fires. Those trees are more vulnerable to insects and disease. There's a lot less different kinds of understory herbaceous plants in the understory because everything's shaded out. Many shrubbed areas are probably now all in conifers. In the past, they may not have been able to grow conifers with frequent fire. There's displacement of deciduous vegetation in riparian areas. The meadows are being taken over by conifers. There's a reduction in loss of meadows for that. Reduction in loss of more open areas. And then the biggest one that concerns people from a safety point of view is the huge buildup in the forest fuels because those dead things are not getting burned up. One of the biggest consequences, obviously, of the buildup in fuels has been the increase in high severity fires. This is a picture of the Rimfire, and in the background there you can see some areas that burn at very high severity. Fires that burn now are much more likely to be high severity, meaning that all or most of the trees are killed. So there still is quite a bit of variety. It has a lot to do with the weather during the fire event. Here is a picture of the Hancock Fire in 2006. The red is high severity, the green is low severity, and the yellow is in between. And you can see there are patches of high severity where all the trees have been killed, but mostly those are on south-facing slopes, which means that it's drier and hotter there. And so it's not a very high percentage here. On the other hand, here in 2002 is a picture of the Biscuit Fire in Oregon, and you have much larger areas of red, which means very high, large areas of high severity fire patches where all these trees were killed. So there's a number of, there's a variety, but on average we've documented that the percentage of area burning at high severity has increased dramatically from 17% in 1984 to about 30% in 2006, which is almost 10 years ago now. And I know if these figures had the Rimfire in there, that they would be much higher. So the reason that this is a problem is that the larger the patch is, the less likelihood there'll be a living tree, which could lead to a seed source, which could lead to a new tree. And the patches themselves are getting larger. So here's the Rimfire. The red areas are the high severity fire where almost every tree is killed. 100,000 acres almost, which is about 40% of the area. And you can see there's huge areas without any living tree and left to its own devices. Seeds would have to blow in, and that's a very large area. So it could be a very long time before forests reestablish without some intervention like replanting. So this is why we were so concerned about it. In some areas you'll be seeing some type conversion to shrublands and forests not growing back. Okay, so how does drought affect this trend? Basically, it just makes it more so. This is part of the reason that so many people are concerned about this drought in forest lands. In a drought time, you'll have more fires because there's reduced moisture in the fuels and in the live vegetation, so they're more flammable. There's reduced relative humidity, so anything that starts has a higher chance of getting away. Drought also affects the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. We had very low snowpack this year, and so the snow melting sooner increases the length of the fire season. It just gives you that many more months to have a big fire. And it actually reduces the water availability for firefighting. There are some areas in some of the counties I work with where they're starting to plan for emergency supplies to be able to catch the fires if they get one because their water is so low. The other effect is on tree health. So moisture stress in living trees leads them to be more vulnerable to insects and disease. So one way, if a tree is attacked by a bark beetle, what it needs to do is spit out sap to try and repel and flush the beetles out. If they don't have enough moisture, then they don't have the vigor and even the moisture itself in order to produce the sap, and they're much more likely to die from any insect or disease outbreak and from any wildfire because they just don't have a lot of resilience. So this year, obviously the third year of a 3-year drought, we've already had quite a few more fires. Cal Fire has responded to date to 1,900 fires, which is 300 more than last year at this time in their state and local responsibility areas. That doesn't even count Forest Service starts. They went to peak staffing 2 weeks earlier, had to have extra appropriations in order to respond to wildfires. So we know there's obviously a financial effect as well. And the bad news is that we expect this to just get worse because of climate change. So there's no way to know exactly if one drought is caused by climate change, but we do know as things are warming over time that we expect this trend to continue. So this is a couple of maps from a great site called caladapt.org, which allows you to draw maps of specific local areas. And this is the wildfire risk projections based on model CNRM, and there's 4 or 5 different models that you can look at with slightly different twists. They all show warming. Some of them are not quite sure whether or not we'll get drying, but it doesn't really matter from a wildfire perspective whether or not it's drier as long as it's not in the summer, right? So if it's warmer, you know you're getting lower snowpack and therefore your season is longer, and this is what you end up with. The yellow is 10% more fires. The red is 2.5 times more fires. By 2050, you can see some areas of red here in the Sierra Nevada. By 2100, you see some really dark areas where you expect 7.5 times more wildfires based on just the increase in temperatures and lack of snowpack. So that's the bad news. What to do? And basically the message on what to do is not that different from what we would suggest people do to maintain a resilient forest at any other time. And that's to make sure that you're reducing moisture stress by having a properly thinned forest that doesn't have a whole lot of extra trees. So in high value landscape plants around your house, I do get calls from people who have large pine trees that they're worried about near their house. They could water those in order to reduce the stress on the individual tree. But out in the forest, obviously we can't water all our trees, and the only way to get the moisture levels closer to what trees can survive on is to have them thinned to the appropriate stocking level. So there's not as much competition, and what moisture is there goes into one tree instead of 20. That way the individual tree is more vigorous. I'm going to talk a little more about that. Also, other things you can do are promote drought-tolerant species in your forest over time as you're doing your planning to make sure you're keeping that in mind. Treat more heavily near your home as far as thinning and that sort of thing to protect your home. And then create defensible space and harden your home, because really, I think I showed you earlier, it's not a question of if there will be a fire in your area, it's a question of when, and you need to be ready for how that's going to work. So reducing moisture stress by thinning. Thinning is used as a way to substitute for the historical fire regime by altering the forest structure. So what you see right there is a little feller buncher, and they come up and they cut the little trees down and pull them out. Depending on the economics, it can be breaking even. It could potentially be subsidized by some state grants, or if you have some larger trees you can sell, it could actually pay for itself, depending on how close you are to a mill and a biomass plant. So there's a lot of this going on. There have been a lot of great funding programs from the state to try and help landowners to get their forests more resilient. So that's the #1 way of improving your chances to survive drought that we can recommend. Prescribed fire is a great way to reduce your stocking as well. There's a lot of barriers. CAL FIRE does have a program that can help you with that called the Veg Management Program. But obviously in the middle of the drought is not when you want to be doing that. So a lot of the things that we would suggest you do are things that probably you should have done 2 years ago or the year before, and things you can think about next year, but not any emergency response. Trees are such long-lived organisms, and forest management is a 100-year proposition that we would encourage you to think about this as a warning, wake-up call for the next drought, and to be planning ahead in all your forest management operations. So the good thing about reducing the moisture stress by thinning is it also reduces vulnerability to insects and disease. So insects and disease are a natural part of our forest system. You have to have decay in order to complete the cycle. Insects are very important in the wildlife sourcing. And generally, we have insects in endemic levels, which means that most tree mortality is kind of localized. There's a few trees in a small area. When things get bad, we would call that an epidemic level, booms and busts of large outbreaks. And most of these, unfortunately, happen during droughts. So it's a special concern right now to keep an eye on trees and see if there's any insect activity. And just like wildfire risk reduction, the best defense is to thin to an appropriate stocking level to fight off insects themselves. Some insects can respond to insecticide. It's a very expensive proposition. Oftentimes you won't know they're there until they've already killed the tree. So prevention is always the best method. The next thing you want to think about in your forest management operations are that you're actively promoting drought-tolerant species. So the tree species in the mixed conifer forest vary in their tolerance to drought. That's why they're found at the elevations that they're found, because that's where they're best adapted. So the list on the right is all the Sierra Nevada species, or most of them, in descending order from most drought tolerant to least drought tolerant. So oaks are more tolerant than pines, which are more tolerant than firs. They like a lot of moisture. So if you're doing some sort of a forest management operation, meaning you're thinning trees, what you want to be doing is selecting for the most tolerant trees for your site so that you'll be ready for future droughts. One big problem we have in the Sierra is a fill-in of a lot of these white fir in relatively dry areas because they weren't burned, and fewer ponderosa pine. So we recommend that landowners actively select white firs out. Not all of them, we like them. But if you have to choose between two healthy trees, you would want to promote the most drought tolerant. And they're drought tolerant based on their characteristics. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about thinning and does it work? Because people do ask me that. Generally, the answer is absolutely yes. We know that thinning works and helps trees survive wildfires. So this is data from Hugh Savard at the Region 5 Office of the U.S. Forest Service. 6 fires combined in 2010. And he went out and looked at the treated and untreated areas and how much trees survived. So where areas that were treated, which means thinned, 80% of the trees survived the wildfire that came through. In the untreated areas, not thinned, but just hadn't been burned in 100 years, like a lot of the Sierra, only 30% of the trees survived. And so you can see a huge difference in tree survival. That's what we mean by it worked. It doesn't mean that we stopped it. It's that we reduced the severity of the fire. So this graph also shows from that same study the percentage of the area that burned at high severity. So in the white is low severity. So 60% of a treated or thinned area burned at low severity, about 30 at moderate, meaning some trees died, and about 10% high severity, meaning all the trees died, compared to an untreated area. High severity fire, 70%, all the trees died. This shows that it works, and it's also getting us back to closer to how the forests were before we started suppressing fire so much. Here's a site that was discovered, or some data collected by Liebberg back in 1902, and he looked at fires, post-fires, and it looks very close to our treated area. We also have a great reference site down in Baja, California, where fires haven't been suppressed until recently, and they have had large droughts, many years. Wildfires go through, and afterwards 5% of the trees died. So we know that thinning seriously promotes resilient forests. So I just wanted to suggest also that you should think about spatial pattern. I'm not going to give you a lot of detail on that. You could use fuel breaks, defensible fuel profile zones, splats, which are strategically placed land area treatments. There's a number of different methods of doing this, and if you're doing any active thinning, you're going to be enrolling a registered professional forester who will give you advice on the actual areas to do it and the spatial arrangements. But basically the goal is to reduce the patterns. So fuel breaks, might be along a road where your ignition source is. And you want to reduce the likelihood it's going to carry through the forest and improve the ability of fire suppression forces to deploy along your road and therefore stop the fire. Also, it's important to think about your home. So homes are actually the biggest fuel in the forest. There's a wood home burning in the Angora Fire, which is in my hometown of South Lake Tahoe in 2007. And I wanted to show you this picture to ask you to think about why this house is burning. If you look closely, you'll notice that none of these trees are on fire. This was a house that burned in a wildfire, but it didn't burn because of a wall of flame contacting the house. It's fully engulfed, it burned to the ground. This is why it burned. So, this is a great publication by our Nevada Extension colleagues, and this is an ember shower. So you have a big fire burning somewhere, and what you have is all these embers being blown off and hitting the house. And if they find something flammable, they will be happy and catch it on fire. So, this applies to anybody in California. A lot of the ways that houses burn down we know about from Southern California wildfires. So here's an example. This was in the Angora Fire. You have spots of fire. Here's an ember that landed in a little pine needle bed on a wooden set of stairs. I'm not exactly sure how this picture got taken, but whoever was there was running by and was not able to put out the fire. Almost all the houses that burn in big fires burn in the first few hours because there aren't enough firefighters. In this case, they were all out at the head of the fire. The fire started at 2 in the afternoon and all the houses burned down by 6 in the evening that very night. And so there's just not enough people to handle this. And a small fire takes a couple hours maybe to burn into this wood, break this window, and then the house is burning from the inside out. So here it is right when it's starting, and this is it afterwards. You can see this line of stairs right there. There's that tree. Here, I'll show you again. There's the tree, and there's the main part of the house right there, the foundation, right? So this house burned this tree. A lot of people maybe think of it the other way around, and it is the other way around sometimes. We certainly had areas like that. But in general, homes are really vulnerable to wildfires, and spending time looking at the home and reducing its ability to catch fire is going to give you a lot of payoff in the long run and increase your risk of your house surviving a fire. The number one thing you could do is to upgrade your home. So this is a picture of a wood shake roof in my area. These were actually required for scenic reasons 40, 50 years ago when the homes were built. Now it's clear that that was a really bad idea. And so one of the major things you can do to reduce your risk of wildfire is to change your roof. That's an expensive proposition. But if you can do it, that'll give you the most payoff for the buck. If you're building a new home, you now, in a wildfire area, you are required to meet the Urban Interface Building Codes, Chapter 7A, which will not allow wood roofs or a lot of things that are very combustible and flammable. So new homes are less of a concern. Older homes, most of us live in these older homes, and there's a lot we can do to actually upgrade them and reduce their flammable risk. That's the home itself, and then of course we all know about defensible space. It's a law in California, Public Resource Code 4291, that you need to create space that reduces the likelihood of fire transmitting from your home to the wildland, or vice versa. It was actually developed in order to protect the forest from your home and your house fires. It's interpreted by each fire department. CAL FIRE is the ultimate organization that's responsible for enforcing it. The general rules are 30 feet from your home should be a lean, clean, and green area with not a lot of flammable fuels. You need to trim your trees 10 feet away from your chimneys, and then from 30 to 70 to do fuels reduction around the property, or the property line, whichever is closest. And so we hope that you all have been doing that, because no matter where you live in California, you should probably be doing this. Okay, then I just wanted to wrap up with some resources for you. So UC Cooperative Extension has a series of forestry advisors and specialists. You can find us on the website ucanr.edu/forestry. We have a whole forest management curriculum, 24 pamphlets with everything you need to know about how to manage a forest in California. I'm in the Sierra Nevada. We have colleagues elsewhere in the state, and so we can talk to you about whatever your vegetation type is. We also at the UC Berkeley campus have the Center for Fire Research and Outreach, and they have some of the wildfire mitigation tools, all that information about building codes, defensible space. You can find it all there. There's lots of great info. And then also the California Fire Science Consortium, where we're actively working with fire science producers and users to try and help disseminate use of fire science and improve management in California's natural wildlands. So I hope you enjoyed the talk, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions.